You are listening to Last Signal Radio. I am James Carter. What I am about to tell you has no precedent in recorded history. Not in the fall of Rome. Not in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not in the dissolution of any empire that historians have spent centuries trying to explain. What is happening right now, simultaneously, across every inhabited continent on this planet, is the coordinated and cascading failure of governmental authority at a speed and scale that no political scientist, no intelligence agency, and no simulation model has ever projected as possible within a single week. As of this broadcast, the following governments have either formally dissolved, ceased functioning, or lost effective control of their territory. The administrations of France, Argentina, Pakistan, Nigeria, South Korea, Peru, and Ukraine have issued formal dissolution or emergency suspension notices. The governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, India, Germany, and Indonesia are in states of acute crisis with contested authority, defecting security forces, and either absent or non-communicative leadership. We do not yet have confirmation on Russia and China. The silence from both is its own form of information.
I want to begin with something that is not a statistic. Yesterday morning, before any of this broke into the open, I was standing in line at a coffee shop 2 blocks from this building. The woman behind me was a teacher. She had a bag full of exercise books she was going to mark over her lunch break. The man in front of me was on his phone arguing cheerfully with someone about football. A child of about 5 was pressing her face against the pastry case. The city was utterly, completely ordinary. I want you to hold that image because what I'm about to tell you happened to that city, to that teacher, to that man, to that child. It happened to the ordinary world without warning and without the courtesy of a slow build. Governments do not usually fall in a single week, except that this week they did. And the question that I keep returning to, the question I cannot stop asking is what does a human being do the morning after the state that organized their life simply ceases to exist? That is the question this broadcast will try to answer. Not politically, humanly.
The trigger sequence requires precise documentation because understanding the mechanism is the only way to understand the scale. It did not begin with a war. It did not begin with a natural disaster. It began with a financial contagion event that moved faster than any prior market collapse because of the degree to which modern financial systems are algorithmically interconnected. 3 weeks ago, the simultaneous insolvency of 4 of the world's 12 largest sovereign wealth funds, triggered by a chain of derivative exposure linked to a previously undisclosed series of leveraged positions in the Chinese property sector, initiated an automated sell-off cascade that no human intervention was fast enough to interrupt. The Dow Jones fell 42% in a single trading session. The FTSE, the DAX, the Nikkei, and the Shanghai Composite all halted trading within minutes of each other as circuit breakers triggered. When they reopened, the falls resumed. The International Monetary Fund, which exists precisely to intervene in these moments, found that its own reserve mechanisms were exposed to the same derivative chain. The IMF issued a statement that it could not fulfill its stabilization role. That statement, 11 words in a press release, is arguably the sentence that ended the world as it existed.
A bank teller named Nadia Kowalski in Warsaw, Poland, has been transmitting through a community radio network since the Polish government suspended operations. She worked at PKO Bank Polski, the largest bank in the country. She says that on the morning the financial system seized, she arrived at work to find a queue of people stretching around the block before the doors opened. She says the queue was quiet. That frightened her more than noise would have. Quiet means people have already moved past panic into something colder. By midday, the bank's digital systems were returning transaction errors. By the afternoon, the cash reserves were gone. She says she stood at her window and told a 70-year-old man that she could not give him his savings. She says he did not shout. He looked at her for a long time, very still. Then he said, "Where do I go?" She says she had no answer. She says she has replayed that sentence every day since. Where do I go? It was not a question about geography. It was a question about the entire structure of a life built on the assumption that institutions would hold. Nadia Kowalski locked the bank doors that evening. She has not gone back.
The political collapse followed the financial collapse with a lag of approximately 4 days, which is faster than any comparable historical precedent. The mechanism was consistent across multiple countries. As bank failures spread and ATMs emptied, civil unrest began in commercial districts and spread outward. Police and security forces, whose salaries had not been processed due to failed government payment systems, began deserting their posts in numbers that overwhelmed command structures. In France, the National Police reported a desertion rate of 31% within 72 hours of the financial freeze. In Argentina, that figure was 58% within the same window. When security forces desert en masse, two things happen simultaneously. The state loses its monopoly on the use of force, and armed non-state actors, organized crime, paramilitary groups, political militias, and opportunistic individuals move immediately into the vacuum. In Buenos Aires, the Peronist militias and rival cartel structures had effectively divided the city into territorial zones before the formal government announcement of dissolution. The government did not fall, and then disorder followed. The disorder came first. The formal dissolution was simply the state acknowledging a reality that had already occurred on the streets.
A pediatric surgeon named Dr. Isabelle Moreau was performing a routine operation in Paris when the lights flickered. Not from a power outage, but because the hospital's financial authorization to draw from the grid had been suspended when the government's payment processing collapsed. The backup generators activated. She finished the surgery. When she walked out of the operating theater, her administrative director told her that the hospital's bank accounts were frozen, supplier deliveries had stopped, and that the security staff had received a notification that their direct deposit accounts had returned errors. She made a decision on the spot. She called every surgeon, nurse, and critical care specialist in the building and told them she was not leaving and she needed to know who else was staying. 41 out of 93 staff on duty that day chose to remain. She has been running the hospital for 11 days on the supplies that were in the building when everything froze. She has performed 19 emergency surgeries by the light of battery-powered surgical lamps. She runs a shift system so that no one works more than a certain number of consecutive days. She has not slept properly since it began. She told a relay operator who asked how she was managing, "I am a surgeon. Managing impossible things in impossible conditions is what I trained for. I just didn't expect the impossible thing to be the entire country."
The United States situation demands particular attention, given its role as the anchor of global political and financial architecture. The President of the United States has not made a public appearance in 6 days. The White House press office issued a single statement 3 days ago, citing an unspecified security situation requiring the President to operate from an undisclosed location. The Vice President appeared briefly on an emergency broadcast 2 days ago before that feed cut. Congressional leadership is physically dispersed. Several senators and representatives have issued individual statements through personal channels, but Congress has not convened as a body and does not currently have a quorum. The Federal Reserve, which is technically independent of the government, issued a statement suspending all normal operations and freezing its balance sheet in place. The U.S. military has not defected and has not been deployed domestically in force. Its officer corps is maintaining chain of command under emergency continuity of government protocols. NORTHCOM has assumed a defensive posture. The United States is not a failed state tonight. It is a state in suspension, its institutions technically intact but functionally paralyzed, its leadership absent, and its streets answering to nobody. There is a difference between a government that has fallen and a government that has simply stopped governing. The United States is currently the latter. That distinction may have an expiration date.
A woman named Rosa Delgado runs a community center in East Los Angeles. Before all of this, her center provided after-school programs, job training, food assistance, and English language classes to about 400 families a week. When the government systems froze, and the SNAP benefit cards stopped processing, and the police stopped answering calls, Rosa did not close. She opened wider. She converted every room in the building. She sent volunteers to every grocery store within walking distance with a message. We are not looting. We are redistributing. Give us what you cannot sell before it spoils. We will feed people. The majority of store owners she approached said yes. She has been feeding between 600 and 900 people a day for the past week out of a building designed for 120 at a time. The line stretches down the block and around the corner. She coordinates through a walkie-talkie network she borrowed from a construction company. She says the most important rule she has established is that nobody eats alone. Families sit together. Strangers sit together. She says that as long as people are eating together, they are not fighting. She says she has not had a single incident of violence in her building since this started. She says she believes this is because hungry people who are fed become something other than desperate. She says give people enough and they remember who they are.
The collapse of law enforcement has followed a pattern across cities that analysts are now identifying as structurally consistent regardless of geography. Phase 1. Payment failure. Officers stop receiving salaries. Phase 2. Command uncertainty. Senior leadership issues conflicting directives as government authority fragments. Phase 3. Selective desertion. Officers with families to protect prioritize personal survival over institutional duty. Phase 4. Dissolution. The remaining officers, without backup, without dispatch, without legal authority from a functioning government, cannot maintain order alone and withdraw. The timeline from Phase 1 to Phase 4 has averaged between 4 and 9 days across the 14 major cities for which we have reliable data. In Karachi, Pakistan, a city of 16 million, the process took 5 days. In Seoul, South Korea, one of the most technically sophisticated police forces in the world, it took 7. In Lagos, Nigeria, where the police force had pre-existing structural weaknesses, it took 3. What fills the vacuum varies by city and by what organized structures existed before the collapse. In some cities, criminal organizations have taken territorial control. In others, neighborhood self-defense groups and community militias have formed. In some cities, military units that have maintained cohesion are providing a degree of order without any governmental authority to answer to, which creates its own category of political problem that we do not yet have a framework to analyze.
A high school principal named Samuel Okafor in Abuja, Nigeria, made a decision on the 3rd day that I find difficult to describe without my voice breaking. When the city's police force dissolved and armed factions began moving through the residential neighborhoods near his school, Samuel opened the school gates. He sent students home to bring their families. He sent teachers home to bring their families. He sent the school's 2 security guards, who had stayed at their post without pay because he had asked them personally and they had said yes, to the 4 surrounding streets to tell anyone who was frightened that there was a place to come. By the end of that first day, 412 people were sheltering in Samuel Okafor's school. By the end of the second day, over 900. He organized sleeping areas by classroom. He established a water rationing system from the school's storage tanks. He created a rule, proposed by the students themselves, that any adult who wanted to stay had to take a 4-hour shift doing something useful. Cooking, patrolling the perimeter, teaching the younger children, caring for the elderly and sick. He said it was the students who suggested the rule. He said 17-year-olds understand fairness in a way that adults sometimes forget. He said his school has become the most functional institution in his district. He says he always believed in education. He just didn't know it would save his neighborhood.
The military situation globally represents the single most consequential variable in determining whether this crisis stabilizes or escalates into something from which recovery may not be possible within a generation. 3 nuclear-armed states, the United States, France, and Pakistan, have governments that are either absent, suspended, or dissolved. The question of nuclear command authority in each of these states is the most classified and most urgent question in the world right now. What we can report is this. U.S. Strategic Command has issued a public statement confirming that the nuclear arsenal remains under secure military command and that no launch authority has been delegated below the existing command structure. The French nuclear deterrent, which formally requires presidential authorization, is in a legal gray zone given the president's current status. The French military has not issued any statement on this question, which is itself a statement. Pakistan's nuclear command authority, which was already a subject of international concern given the country's political instability prior to this event, is the scenario that has NATO, India, and China in a state of mutual and intense observation. No shots have been fired. No launches have been detected. The most heavily armed species in the history of the planet is, for this moment, pointing its weapons at the ground. The operative phrase in that sentence is "for this moment."
A retired Pakistani army general named Tariq Mahmood gave a transmission through an Islamabad shortwave relay that reached us through 3 separate relay chains. He is 74 years old. He served for 32 years. He said he is speaking not as a military figure, but as a Pakistani citizen and a grandfather. He said that in his career he had witnessed 3 coups, 2 wars, and more political crises than he could count on both hands. He said that in all of those crises, the institutions bent, but they did not break, because there were always enough people inside the institutions who believed in something larger than themselves. He said the current situation is different, not because the institutions are weaker, but because the economic shock hit every institution simultaneously and left no anchor standing. He said the thing that has kept him awake every night since the collapse is not fear of what the government will do. He said it is the knowledge of what the government will not be there to prevent. He said he is not a pessimist. He said he has spent his life watching Pakistanis survive things that should not be survivable. He said his money is on the people, not the institutions. He said the institutions were always just the people's best attempt to organize themselves. He said when the attempt collapses, the people are still there. He said we were here before the state. We will be here after it.
The financial architecture of modern civilization is not simply broken. It has, in the assessment of the economists still transmitting through functioning channels, undergone what they are calling a legitimacy collapse, a condition distinct from a technical failure because it cannot be resolved by technical means. In a technical failure, the system is broken, but its authority is intact. People will wait for the system to be fixed because they believe the fix is coming and that the fixed system will be worth waiting for. In a legitimacy collapse, the belief itself is gone. People are not waiting for banks to reopen because they no longer believe that a reopened bank represents safety. The loss of that belief, which took 200 years of institutional development to build, happened in approximately 11 days. Currency in several countries has ceased to function as a medium of exchange, not because it is worthless on paper, but because the social consensus that gave it value has dissolved. In Buenos Aires, Nairobi, and Karachi, barter economies have emerged spontaneously in outdoor markets within days. Food, fuel, medicine, and labor are being exchanged directly. A can of cooking oil is worth more than a $50 bill in parts of Lagos tonight. An economist at the London School of Economics, transmitting through a personal shortwave, described what is happening as the fastest reversion to pre-monetary economics in history. He said it was also, in a terrible way, the most honest economics he had ever witnessed.
A woman named Amara Dieng runs a small food stall in the Medina district of Dakar, Senegal. She has sold rice, fish, and groundnut soup from the same stall for 22 years. When the banks froze and the government dissolved and the city's supply chains fractured, she did something that her customers described as entirely characteristic of who she has always been. She kept the stall open. She kept it open when the nearest police station emptied. She kept it open when a group of young men came and told her she needed to pay them for protection. She looked at them and said she had fed 3 of their mothers for 20 years and she would not be paying anyone anything. They left. She says she does not know why they left, except that possibly nobody had ever spoken to them quite that directly before. She began accepting payment in kind. A handful of rice, a piece of cloth, an hour of someone's labor carrying supplies. She has extended credit to every family on her street that she knows. She says she has been extending credit informally for 22 years anyway, and the government collapse has not changed her accounting system because her accounting system was never in a bank. It was in her memory. She knows exactly who owes her what. She says she is not worried about being repaid. She says she is more worried about her regular customers who have not come by. She sends someone to check on them.
The collapse of essential services beyond law enforcement and finance is creating compounding humanitarian crises across urban centers. Sanitation systems, which in most major cities require both electrical power and a functioning administrative apparatus to operate, have begun failing in 14 of the 22 cities for which we have operational data. In Karachi, the pumping stations that manage sewage disposal for a city of 16 million have been operating on skeleton crews working without institutional authority, without pay, and without guaranteed supply lines. The crew chief at the Mahmoudabad pumping station, a man whose name we have not been able to confirm, has kept his station running for 12 consecutive days through sheer force of personal commitment and a team of 8 people who have not left the facility. Without them, the public health consequences for the surrounding population would be catastrophic within days. In Mexico City, water distribution has been maintained in approximately 40% of the metropolitan area through a combination of military coordination and self-organized neighborhood water committees. The 60% without consistent water access is a figure that should be read as a medical emergency. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery do not wait for political situations to stabilize before they begin moving through populations without clean water. History is very consistent on this point.
I want to tell you about a 12-year-old boy in Mumbai, India, named Arjun Sharma. His father is a sanitation worker. When the municipal authority collapsed and the collection schedule stopped, Arjun's father kept going to work anyway. Not because anyone was paying him, because he said someone had to. Arjun started going with him, not because his father asked him to. His father specifically told him not to. Arjun went because he watched his father leave every morning into a city that was becoming dangerous, and he decided he was not going to let his father go alone. They work the same streets his father has worked for 11 years. They are doing it with the same equipment, without any institutional support, without any salary, without any guarantee that the situation will change. Their neighbors have started leaving food at their door, not as payment in any formal sense, as acknowledgement. As the neighborhood's way of saying, we see what you are doing and we are not indifferent to it. Arjun Sharma is 12 years old. He wakes up before dawn and goes to work in a collapsed city because his father does, and he loves his father. And love turns out to be a more durable, motivating force than institutional authority. I think about Arjun Sharma every time I feel despair about what human beings are capable of.
Germany's situation deserves specific analysis because it represents one of the most paradoxical cases in the current global collapse. Germany entered this crisis with what was considered the most robust institutional infrastructure in Europe. A strong constitutional framework, a professional civil service with deep traditions of institutional loyalty, a federal structure that distributes power across 16 states, and a culture of governmental seriousness that is the product of painful historical lessons about what happens when governments fail. And yet Germany's federal government has effectively ceased to function. The Bundestag has not convened. The Chancellor issued a statement 11 days ago and has not been heard from since. The constitutional provisions for governmental continuity, which exist precisely because Germans have thought harder about this than most nations, have been invoked by the President, who technically remains in post and has transferred emergency authority to the 16 state governments. Bavaria has declared itself a functioning autonomous administrative zone and sealed its borders. Hamburg and Bremen are operating under emergency councils composed of former civil servants, business leaders, and union representatives. The eastern states, several of which have weaker institutional infrastructure, have experienced more severe disorder. Germany is not one story. It is 16 stories, some of which are better than others, all of which are the story of a nation that prepared for many emergencies and was not fully prepared for the emergency of the emergency systems themselves failing.
A retired judge named Hilde Brandt in Hamburg, Germany, was asked by the city's emergency council to help establish a temporary adjudication system, a way of resolving disputes, addressing serious crimes, and making binding decisions in the absence of formal courts. She is 70 years old. She had been retired for 4 years. She said yes. She gathered 6 other retired jurists and 2 practicing criminal defense lawyers who were willing to serve. They established what they are calling the Hamburg Emergency Tribunal, sitting in the city's main courthouse, which is still physically intact. They have no police force to enforce their decisions. They rely on the community's willingness to accept their authority as legitimate. She transmitted a brief account of their first week, 41 cases heard ranging from property disputes to a murder. She said the most striking thing about the proceedings was not the severity of the cases, but the hunger of the people involved for a process. She said people wanted a room where they could speak and be heard and have someone with authority listen. She said the legitimacy crisis is not primarily economic. It is, at its deepest level, a crisis of being heard. She said that as long as her tribunal is sitting, she intends to hear everyone who comes to her door. She said that is what a court is. She said that is what it has always been.
The armed faction landscape in collapsed territories is developing along lines that military analysts have consistently predicted, but that no government adequately prepared for. In the absence of state authority, the organizations that fill the vacuum are invariably those that already had organizational structure, territorial knowledge, and access to weapons prior to the collapse. In Mexico, the cartels, which had already established parallel governance structures in significant portions of the country before the federal government dissolved, have moved rapidly to formalize their territorial control. In the northern states of Sonora, Chihuahua, and Tamaulipas, cartel leadership has issued what amount to public governance announcements, establishing rules of conduct, setting prices for basic goods, providing protection to compliant neighborhoods, and applying severe consequences to those who challenge their authority. This is not anarchy. It is a replacement sovereignty, brutal, coercive, and entirely outside any democratic framework, but organizationally coherent. In eastern Ukraine, various military and paramilitary formations that were already operating in the region have expanded their territorial control in the governmental vacuum. In the Philippines, the New People's Army, which had been operating as an insurgency for decades, has moved into provincial administrative roles in at least 4 provinces. The shape of the world that emerges from this collapse will be substantially determined by which of these replacement sovereignties consolidates, which collapses under its own contradictions, and which is displaced by something more legitimate.
There is a different kind of story coming from the mountains of Oaxaca in Mexico, where an indigenous community called San Marcos Tlapazola has been governing itself through traditional communal assembly, the tequio system, for longer than the Mexican state has existed. When the federal government dissolved and the state government of Oaxaca went silent, San Marcos Tlapazola held a community assembly, as they have held community assemblies for every major decision for centuries. They decided what they would share, what they would protect, how they would receive people fleeing from the cities, and what obligations those arriving from outside would take on. A journalist who had been working in the region and became stranded there transmitted an account that I keep returning to. She said she had come from Mexico City, which was chaos. She arrived in San Marcos Tlapazola and found a community that was not in chaos. Not because nothing had changed, everything had changed, but because the community's decision-making structure had never been dependent on the state to begin with. She said she sat in the assembly and watched farmers and weavers and teachers and elders deliberate and vote and implement decisions and hold each other accountable. She said she had spent years studying political science. She said she learned more about functional governance in 3 days in San Marcos Tlapazola than in any lecture hall.
The international coordination infrastructure, the United Nations system, the World Bank, the International Criminal Court, the World Trade Organization, is in a state of suspended animation. The United Nations Security Council attempted to convene an emergency session 12 days ago. The session could not achieve quorum because the representatives of 3 permanent members were either unreachable, operating without governmental authority, or had been recalled by governments that no longer formally existed. The UN Secretary-General issued a statement from the organization's New York headquarters acknowledging the collapse of the multilateral system as currently constituted and calling for the formation of an emergency coordination mechanism among whatever governmental authorities remain functional. That statement was made to a press corps of 11 journalists. The building's security staff has been maintaining order at their own initiative, without pay, for 9 days. The UN cafeteria is still open. The flag still flies. The institution that was built from the ruins of the Second World War to prevent the next catastrophe is sitting largely empty in Manhattan, its flags flying above a city that is feeding itself through an improvised network of community kitchens and whose police department is operating at 36% capacity. There is something both tragic and clarifying about an institution that was built to prevent collapse, watching collapse happen, and finding that its mechanisms are not equipped to address the kind of collapse that occurred.
A UN interpreter named Yuki Tanaka has been in the UN building in New York for 11 days. She came to work the morning the markets collapsed, and she has not left. She is Japanese, 43 years old, fluent in 6 languages. She told a colleague who relayed her account to us that she stayed not out of institutional loyalty, but out of a practical calculation. The building has a generator, clean water, and food. But she also said something else. She said that in the first days, when the building was nearly empty and the delegates had scattered, she walked the General Assembly Hall alone. She stood at the podium. She looked at the empty seats arranged in their concentric arcs, the nameplates still at each delegation's place. She said she thought about all the speeches that had been given in that room, all the arguments, the failures, the moments when language had almost bridged an unbridgeable gap. She said she sat in the chair that belongs to the delegation of a country whose government no longer exists, and she felt not despair exactly, but the specific weight of something that had been built with enormous effort and was now temporarily or permanently not functioning. She said she will stay until someone tells her to leave. She said she is not sure anyone has the authority to tell her anymore. She said she finds that strangely liberating.
The information environment in the current crisis has become one of the most dangerous secondary threats to any prospect of stabilization. With mainstream media organizations either shuttered, operating in severely reduced capacity, or themselves subject to seizure by armed factions in some regions, the information space has fragmented into 1,000 competing narratives, many of them deliberately false, and some of them intentionally designed to inflame. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a coordinated disinformation campaign transmitted through still-functioning mobile networks falsely claimed that the municipal water supply had been poisoned by a political faction, a claim with no factual basis whatsoever. The result was a stampede at water distribution points that killed 17 people and injured over 100 before the claim was publicly debunked by a network of volunteer fact-checkers operating through shortwave. In South Korea, false reports of an imminent North Korean military incursion, transmitted through anonymous channels after the South Korean government collapsed, drove mass displacement from Seoul that clogged major roads and created humanitarian conditions that were more dangerous than any actual military threat. Information, in the absence of trusted institutions to validate it, becomes a weapon wielded by anyone with a transmitter and a willingness to cause harm. Last Signal Radio is one of the few remaining broadcasts with a commitment to verification. We are aware of how much weight that places on this signal.
A librarian in Seoul named Park Ji-soo made a decision that has quietly become one of the most important acts of civic service in her city. The Central Public Library where she works became, in the absence of any other trusted information source, the place people came to find out what was true. She and her 4 remaining colleagues, the other staff went home to their families, and she does not blame them, set up a verification desk at the front of the library. People bring rumors. Park Ji-soo and her team research them using every source available: books, archived newspapers, their own expertise, cross-referenced accounts from trusted relay networks. They post their findings on a board outside the library entrance that is updated throughout the day. The queue to submit a rumor for verification stretches down the steps and along the pavement. She said she has been a librarian for 19 years, and people always asked her where to find information. She said the only thing that has changed is the urgency. She said the function of a library, and organizing knowledge, verifying sources, making information accessible to everyone regardless of their means, is exactly what a collapsing society needs most. She said she used to have to justify the library's budget every year to a government that wondered if libraries were still necessary. She said she does not think that argument will come up again for a while.
By the end of the second week, the collapse has entered what political analysts, those still operating, are calling the consolidation phase. This is the period in which the initial shock of governmental dissolution gives way to a more stable, if deeply disturbing, new landscape of competing authorities. The consolidation phase is historically the most dangerous period in a governmental collapse, because it is the phase in which the replacement authorities establish themselves through force, and the degree of violence involved in that establishment determines the character of whatever comes next. In Nigeria, a coalition of military officers, acting without formal governmental authority, but with the consent of a significant portion of their own forces, has announced the formation of a National Stabilization Council and has taken control of the fuel distribution infrastructure and the central bank's physical reserves. They have announced their intention to hold elections within 1 year. Military councils announcing elections within 1 year have a mixed historical record. In Indonesia, a different process is underway. The surviving governors of Java's 6 provinces have formed a regional confederation and are operating a coordinated administrative structure that has maintained essential services in the most populous island on Earth for 11 days. Indonesia's decentralized administrative traditions, built over decades precisely because Jakarta's central authority was historically unreliable, are serving it now in ways that its architects could not have anticipated.
A farmer named Jibril Koulibaly in the Sikasso region of Mali has become, entirely without intending to, one of the most important people in his district. He farms millet, sorghum, and cowpeas on 12 hectares. He has done so for 30 years. When the government dissolved and the regional administrative offices went dark and the aid organizations pulled out their staff, his farm was already producing food. It had always been producing food. It did not require the state to function. What changed was the number of people who needed what he was producing. Families from the regional capital began arriving on foot. He fed the ones who arrived first. When he could not feed everyone, he did something that he says his father taught him, and his father's father taught his father. He opened his land to cooperative cultivation. Any family that wanted to eat would work. He would provide the seed and the tools. The harvest would be shared. Within 2 weeks, 60 families were farming his land alongside him. He said he did not organize this. He said it organized itself because the logic of it was obvious to anyone who has ever been hungry. He said hunger is a very efficient teacher of cooperation. He said his father always told him that the land does not care about governments. He said his father was right.
The situation in India requires its own assessment because it defies simple categorization. India's federal government has not formally dissolved. The President of India remains in post and has invoked emergency constitutional provisions. However, the practical reality is that governance has devolved entirely to the state level, and the situation varies so dramatically between states that India cannot be analyzed as a single entity in this crisis. Kerala, in the south, with its historically high literacy rates, strong cooperative economic traditions, and robust local governance infrastructure, has maintained essential services with remarkable effectiveness. The state government is functional, police and civil services are largely intact, and community-level organizations built over decades of progressive policy have activated as support networks. Uttar Pradesh, with a population of 240 million and significant pre-existing poverty and institutional weakness, is in acute crisis. Delhi, the capital, is a divided city with functional order in some districts and serious disorder in others, determined largely by the density and cohesion of the neighborhood communities that existed before the collapse. India is not one crisis. It is 28 states and 8 union territories, each making their own improvised response to the same catastrophe. And the spread between the best and worst outcomes within a single country is a study in how much pre-existing community investment matters when the center fails.
A school teacher in Kerala named Meera Nair transmitted an account that I think will be studied for years after this crisis ends. She teaches at a government school in a small town called Kottayam. When the collapse began and people were frightened and looking for information, her school became an information center. She used the school's functioning generator to power a radio relay that broadcast verified information to the surrounding district. She organized her students, teenagers most of them, into a network of community liaisons. Each student was responsible for a cluster of 10 to 15 households, checking on residents, relaying needs, distributing information, and reporting back. She said she framed it to the students as a civics project. She said they took to it with a seriousness she had never seen them apply to any formal curriculum. She said a 16-year-old boy who had never shown interest in anything except his phone spent 12 hours walking between households, taking notes on who needed medicine, who needed food, who was injured, who was alone. She said he told her when he came back at the end of the day that he had not known most of the people who lived within walking distance of his house. He said he had lived among strangers his whole life and not known it. He said he would not make that mistake again.
The question of which institutions have survived the collapse, and why, is one that will define the Reconstruction effort. The pattern that emerges from data across multiple collapsed states is consistent and instructive. The institutions that have survived are not necessarily the most powerful, the best funded, or the most technologically sophisticated. They are the ones that maintained direct relationships with the populations they served. Municipal fire departments have maintained higher operational rates than police forces across multiple countries, not because fires are more dangerous than crime, but because fire departments are embedded in communities in a way that creates personal loyalty that transcends institutional payment systems. Firefighters in Naples, Italy, have been operating without pay for 15 days because they live in the neighborhoods they protect. Their children go to school with the children of the people in those neighborhoods. And the idea of leaving those people unprotected is not an abstraction. Teachers have remained at significantly higher rates than government bureaucrats. Doctors and nurses at higher rates than hospital administrators. The correlation is direct. The closer an institution's daily function to the direct well-being of a specific human community, the the higher its survival rate through the collapse. The institutions that processed people, that saw them as accounts, cases, applicants, voters, have fallen faster than the institutions that knew them by name.
I want to tell you about loss, because I have been speaking for days about resilience and courage and community, and all of it is real and all of it matters, and none of it should obscure the fact that people are dying who would not be dying if the world had held together. A man named Viktor Petrenko in Kiev, Ukraine, needed kidney dialysis 3 times a week. When the hospital system fractured and the dialysis centers lost their supply chains, he had 2 treatments missed. His wife Olena transmitted his name and his story through a relay network, not as an accusation, not as a call for help that had any realistic chance of arriving in time, but because she wanted him known. She wanted someone to know that he had been a mathematics teacher for 31 years, that he made terrible puns that made his students groan and then laugh, that he grew tomatoes on their apartment balcony every summer, that he was afraid at the end, but he held her hand and he did not let go. Viktor Petrenko. His name should be in the record of this time. Alongside every nurse who stayed at their post, every farmer who opened their land, every judge who kept their court, Viktor Petrenko, who needed a machine to stay alive, and the machine stopped working when the world stopped working, should be in that record too. The record of this time must hold both things, what people became capable of and what they lost.
A breakthrough in the coordination effort emerged at the end of the 2nd week from an unexpected source. A network of municipal mayors, operating completely outside the now defunct national governmental structures, began transmitting coordinated policy statements through shortwave radio networks. The network began with the mayors of Barcelona, Bogota, and Accra, who had pre-existing relationships through an urban climate cooperation framework, and expanded within days to include the mayors or their equivalents of 47 cities across 6 continents. The network, which they have called the Open Cities Compact, has no formal legal authority. It has no enforcement mechanism. What it has is the practical authority that comes from being the highest functioning governmental entities remaining in most of the territories they represent. The Compact has issued a series of practical coordination agreements. Mutual recognition of each city's improvised governance arrangements, protocols for the movement of goods and people between member cities, a shared information standard for verifying factual claims, and a framework for collective security against armed factions that threaten civilian populations. The political scientists who built theories about the irrelevance of cities in the age of the nation-state are having a difficult week.
The mayor of Barcelona, a woman named Claudia Ferrer, who was a municipal architect before she entered politics, transmitted a statement through the Open Cities Compact network that has been relayed around the world. She said, "Cities are where most people have always actually lived their lives. Not in nations, not in ideological abstractions, but in streets and neighborhoods and markets and schools and community centers. The state was always an arrangement made at a distance from those streets. What we are learning now is that the streets were always the reality. The state was always to some degree a representation of the streets' needs and a coordination mechanism for their management. When the representation fails, the streets do not disappear. They simply have to manage themselves." She said Barcelona is managing itself. She said it is imperfect and frightening, and some days are very bad. She said no day has been hopeless. She said that as long as La Boqueria market is open, and she said it has been open every day, run by the vendors themselves, trading in whatever currency or barter people have available, she knows her city is alive. She said a city that still has a market is a city that still has a future. I have thought about that sentence every day since I heard it.
The Reconstruction question, how governmental authority is reestablished and in what form, is the existential political question of the coming months and years. 3 distinct trajectories are emerging in the territories for which we have data. The first trajectory is military consolidation. A surviving or reconstituted military force establishes order through force, declares a transitional authority, and promises eventual democratic restoration. This trajectory has the advantage of speed and the disadvantage of history. Military transitional governments have a poor record of voluntarily transferring power. The second trajectory is community federation. The spontaneous governance structures that emerged at the local level, neighborhood councils, city compacts, regional confederations, formalize their relationships into a new governmental architecture built from the bottom up rather than imposed from the top down. This trajectory is slower, messier, and more likely to produce something that reflects the actual needs and values of the populations involved. The third trajectory, visible in several regions, is replacement sovereignty. A pre-existing non-state organization, criminal, ideological, or ethnic, consolidates territorial control and establishes a new order on terms entirely determined by its own interests. The proportion of the world's population that ends up under each of these trajectories will determine what the political map looks like in 5 years. That map is being drawn right now, in the streets, not in any surviving chancellery.
In the third week, something began happening in cities around the world that no analyst had included in their models. People started cleaning. Not because anyone told them to, not because a government sanitation department issued a directive. Because the streets were dirty, and people live in them, and dirty streets become dangerous streets, and dangerous streets become places where children cannot play, and where the elderly cannot move safely. In Nairobi, a neighborhood called Kibera, one of the largest informal settlements in Africa, a place that the Kenyan state had largely failed for decades, organized a community cleaning effort that began with 20 people and within 3 days involved over 3,000. They collected waste. They cleared blocked drainage channels. They painted walls. A young woman named Wanjiru Kamau, who organized the effort, said she had no particular reason for starting it except that she walked past a pile of garbage and found she could not keep walking. She said she picked up the first piece. Someone else picked up the second. She said that is how it always starts. She said the question is never whether there is enough will. The question is always who picks up the first piece. She said she happened to be the one walking past at the right moment. She said anyone walking past at the right moment would have done the same. She said she believes that completely. I believe it too.
The economic reconstruction question is being addressed by a group of economists, central bankers, and development specialists who have been meeting through a shortwave relay network under what they are calling the Emergency Scheme Economic Architecture Initiative. Their working assumption, stated plainly in their first transmission, is that the pre-collapse financial architecture cannot and should not be restored in its prior form. The system that collapsed was one that had accumulated sufficient fragility, opacity, and systemic risk over decades to make a collapse of this kind not merely possible, but in retrospect, almost inevitable. Their proposals center on 3 principles. First, any new currency or exchange system must be grounded in something tangible and locally verifiable, no instrument whose value depends on a chain of abstractions beyond ordinary comprehension. Second, financial institutions must be prohibited from achieving scales at which their failure endangers the broader system. The too-big-to-fail architecture that contributed directly to the collapse is a design flaw, not a feature. Third, the decision-making structures of financial institutions must include meaningful representation from the communities they affect, not merely the shareholders they serve. These principles are not new. They have been proposed by economists for decades. They were not implemented because the institutions that would need to implement them had no incentive to do so. Those institutions no longer exist.
A woman named Elena Vasquez in Santiago, Chile, worked for 20 years as a financial analyst for one of the large banks that collapsed in the first week. She spent those 20 years understanding the financial system from the inside. She said she saw the fragility. She said everyone working at the level she worked at could see the fragility. She said the problem was not that no one understood the risk. The problem was that the system was structured so that the people who understood the risk were also the people most incentivized to pretend it did not exist. She said the morning her bank collapsed, she felt 2 things simultaneously: devastation, because the institution she had spent her career in was gone, and a recognition she was ashamed of. She said she recognized that a system she had suspected was built on an unsustainable architecture had proven to be exactly that. She said she does not take any satisfaction in being right. She said she takes the recognition as an obligation. She is now working with the Emergency Economic Architecture Initiative. She said she knows exactly which mechanisms failed and why. She said she intends to spend the rest of her career making sure they cannot be rebuilt in the same form. She said she owes that to the people who lost their savings in banks she helped build. She said it will not make them whole. She said it is the only thing she has to offer.
At the end of the third week, the first formal governmental restoration has been confirmed. The Republic of Iceland, population 370,000, geographically isolated, with a historically high level of civic participation and institutional trust, has re-established a functioning government through an emergency constitutional convention convened by the President and attended by representatives of every municipality, major civil society organization, and professional association in the country. The convention operated without the dissolved parliament, drawing its legitimacy instead from the breadth of its representation. It has produced an emergency governance framework, restored the central bank under a new mandate, and organized a coordinated national resource allocation system. Iceland is not the world. 370,000 people on an island in the North Atlantic is not a template that scales directly to India or Nigeria or Brazil, but it is a proof of concept. It demonstrates that a democratic legitimacy can be reconstituted without violence, without military authority, and without any external assistance. It demonstrates that a community that knows itself, that has the civic density to convene, debate, and decide, can rebuild its own governance from below. The political scientists will study Iceland for decades. The more immediate lesson is simpler. It is possible. It has been done. There is a working model.
The Icelandic Convention included, as one of its first acts, a formal acknowledgement of the people who maintained essential services without governmental authority during the collapse. The acknowledgement was read aloud in the convention hall and transmitted through every available communication channel. It listed not titles or positions, but acts. The nurses who stayed at Landspítali Hospital. The geothermal plant workers who kept the heating system running through the worst of the crisis. The fishing crews who kept working because their communities needed food. The farmers. The teachers who held informal schools. The community radio operators, the volunteers who checked on elderly neighbors. The acknowledgement did not call them heroes, it called them citizens. It said the convention was meeting because of them, not in spite of the collapse. It said the new government they were building was not a restoration of the previous state. It was an attempt to build something more honest. Something that had earned its authority by being useful, not by being powerful. I want you to hear that sentence. A government that earns its authority by being useful. I have been covering governments for 20 years, and I have never heard one define itself quite that way. I think it might be the most important thing said in any official setting in the world this year.
The month-end assessment of the global situation presents a picture that defies a single characterization. Approximately 30% of the world's national governments have either been formally restored, replaced by functioning transitional authorities, or reconstituted at the sub-national level in forms that are providing effective governance. Approximately 40% are in the consolidation phase, contested between competing authority structures with outcomes still uncertain. Approximately 30% are in conditions of acute disorder with no clear authority structure and significant humanitarian crisis. The global death toll attributable directly to governmental collapse through violence, failure of medical infrastructure, sanitation collapse, and the disruption of food supply chains has reached an estimated 8 million over 3 weeks, with modeling suggesting a trajectory toward 20 to 25 million over the following months if the current pace of stabilization efforts is not accelerated. The global economy, in any meaningful sense, has ceased to exist. What exists in its place is a patchwork of local economies, barter networks, community resource systems, and emerging city-to-city trade arrangements. The reconstruction of a global economic system from these components is a project that economists estimate will take between 5 and 15 years. The reconstruction of governmental legitimacy, which is ultimately a cultural and psychological achievement as much as an institutional one, will take a generation.
I have been in this chair for 3 weeks. I want to tell you what that has been like, not for catharsis, but because I think it is honest, and honesty is what we owe each other right now. The first days were the most frightening because the shape of what was happening was not yet clear, and the unknown shape of a catastrophe is more frightening than the known shape, however terrible the known shape turns out to be. I was frightened for my family, who I could not reach for 4 days. I was frightened for the world in a way I had never been frightened for the world before, because the world had always had, however imperfectly, a structure, and the structure was gone. What surprised me, what I did not expect, was what happened after the shape became clear. After the first week, when I understood that this was not going to be resolved in days, something changed in how I was sitting in this chair. I stopped waiting for the emergency to end and started reporting the world that had replaced it. And the world that replaced it was not the world I feared when I didn't know its shape. It was worse in some ways. It was better in others. It contained, in proportions I could not have predicted, both the worst and the most extraordinary things I have ever witnessed human beings do. I do not know how this ends. I know that the people I have been telling you about are still in it. I know that you are still in it. I know that I am still here. And I know that as long as I am still here, I will tell you what I see.
Let me state for the record, with the precision this moment requires, what I believe the historical ledger of these weeks will show. It will show the catastrophic failure of a global institutional architecture that had been built on assumptions of stability that were not tested until they were broken. It will show that the warning signs were present and were not acted upon, and that the communities which paid the highest price for that inaction were not the communities that made the decisions that produced it. It will show the extraordinary resilience of human beings when stripped of the systems they were told were necessary for civilization. It will show that civilization, the actual substance of it, the cooperation and care and knowledge sharing and mutual protection that the word was always meant to describe, did not require the institutions. The institutions were always a representation of something that existed before them and continues to exist without them. It will show that the most important units of human survival are not nations or economies, but communities. The groups of people who know each other's names and have a sense of shared obligation that no government created and no collapse can remove. And it will show that in the worst weeks in the history of modern political organization, human beings did what they have always done in the worst times. They found each other. They fed each other. They protected each other. They rebuilt.
This is Kate Vincent. Last Signal Radio has been broadcasting continuously for 3 weeks. We have lost 2 colleagues who were with us at the beginning. Our overnight producer, Marcus Webb, who left to reach his family and did not come back, and our researcher, Amelia Torres, who became ill and whose current condition we do not know. We hold them with us in this room and in every transmission. I want to close with something that happened outside this building this morning. A woman was standing on the pavement directly below our window. She was elderly. She was holding a hand-lettered sign. The sign said in large, careful letters, "I am listening. I do not know what comes next. I am not afraid." I looked at her for a long time. I don't know who made that sign or why she was standing there or what exactly she meant by not afraid. I know that she was standing outside in the early morning with a sign that she had made by hand, addressed to no one specific and to everyone at once. I know she looked up at the building and did not flinch. I know that in 3 weeks of reporting everything that human beings are capable of, she is the image I will carry longest. An old woman with a handmade sign on an uncertain morning, not afraid, still listening, still there. This is Last Signal Radio. We are still here. So are you. Stay with us.
This is James Carter. When I came to this microphone 3 weeks ago, I told you that what was happening had no precedent in recorded history. I want to qualify that now. The fall of governments is not unprecedented. The failure of financial systems is not unprecedented. The dissolution of institutions that seemed permanent is not unprecedented. What the historical record shows, if you read it carefully, and with the correct emphasis, is that every collapse in human history was followed by reconstruction, not restoration. Reconstruction, the thing that was built after, was not the thing that fell. It was informed by what fell, was designed to address what fell, and was built by people who had survived the falling and who carried in their bodies the knowledge of what the falling cost. We are in the falling. The reconstruction has also begun, simultaneously, because human beings do not wait for permission to start rebuilding. They start rebuilding in the wreckage. They start the morning after. They start before the night is over. Jibril Coulibaly opened his land in Mali. Rosa Delgado opened her community center in East Los Angeles. Hildebrandt opened her court in Hamburg. Samuel Okafor opened his school in Abuja. Wanjiru Kamau picked up the first piece of garbage in Kibera. They did not wait for governments. They did not wait for institutions. They did not wait. The reconstruction of the world is already underway. It is being done by ordinary people who decided, in the absence of everything else, to be responsible for each other. That is what civilization has always been. We remembered it. This has been last signal radio. We are still transmitting. We will not stop.